Good evening and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, both our live viewers and those catching up on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Please can I remind you also to consider making a donation to charity in lieu of a registration fee. Those regular viewers will know by now that we list our supported charities on our website, havewegotplanningnews4you.com, or of course encourage you to make a donation to a local charity. Now we're extremely privileged to welcome onto our show this evening somebody I'm completely in awe of, Níall McLaughlin, MBE, RA, etc., one of the world's leading architects, no exaggeration at all, and a thoroughly fascinating, interesting man, as we shall find out. So Níall, welcome. I hope you're well. Where are you calling us from? And what have you chosen as our theme for this evening, in case people haven't guessed already?
Well, I'm calling you from my studio here in London, and the backdrop behind you is the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, which is something I'll talk about in a moment when you give me a chance.
Fantastic. Well, you might as well tell us about it now. Why have you chosen it?
Well, I'm fascinated by it because apart from being an absolutely stunning architectural intervention into a beautiful landscape between two large bodies of water, magical place to visit, people often concentrate on the mystery of it. But in fact, the thing that I find most fascinating about it is the work that the archaeologists have done on it, to say that rather than being a singular monument in the landscape, when they looked at the origin of each of the stones, they realized that the different stones had been dragged by different communities for miles across the archipelago and placed together. So each community from different parts of the place were spending months and even years dragging these huge stones and putting them together. And then when they looked at the foundations, they realized that rather than being a single monument, which was intended from the beginning, these stones are moved around. So the different colors are the different quarries that the stones came from. So at a time when resources were extremely lean, these Neolithic people were spending a huge amount of their energy dragging these stones and then rearranging them in a circle. And what I realized is this isn't an object, it's a performance. It's like a dance that all of these villages and communities are doing and putting a huge amount of their time into. And one of the archaeologists said something very interesting. He said that construction in those times probably took the place of blood. In other words, as communities got larger, the bonds of kinship would get looser. And what they would do is construct things together to reinforce their bonds to each other. So they owed each other a debt through construction. And it seems to me that we, when we're involved in building and planning, forget that we haven't always made buildings. And one of the purposes we've had for making buildings is that even the act of construction itself is a way of drawing us together into communities. So it's that sense of architecture and construction being communal processes, not simply objects that we intend to complete, but the process itself of the building becoming is a way of holding us together as communities. And that's something that fascinates me and is maybe at the center of my vocation.
Fantastic. I told you were in for a treat, viewers. Thank you, Níall. I've actually been there. My mum did an archaeology course in Orkney just after I finished school, and we drove up. So I've been there, and I have got a glass of, you can't see it at the backdrop, but Highland Park 18-year-old whiskey, one of the best whiskies around. So Níall, thank you so much for coming on the show. Hugely looking forward to the interview with the second half of the show. As you know, and viewers know, if you want to say anything in the first half of the show while we do our roundup, I'm not sure you'll have necessarily battery storage for the schemes, and Quarries in Kidderminster are quite your layer of world-class architecture, but you never know, there might be something of interest. But if not, feel free to just listen in, and then we'll have the chat with you in the second half. I'm sure battery storage can be beautiful, by the way, just in case anyone's really into that. And in the meantime, Thea, how are you?
Hello, good evening. Very well, thank you. Hello, everyone, and hello, Níall. And thanks so much for that incredibly well thought out theme. That was fascinating to learn about in those few short minutes. Looking forward to the second half of the show. So thanks for that. I am at home, just arrived home. I've been site visiting up in Paul's neck of the wood today. But done with that now. Battery storage systems, solar farms, all the good stuff. And looking forward to talking about a battery storage decision shortly.
Fantastic. Chris, how are you doing? Not time for bed yet.
Yeah, I know. Well, I haven't got a picture to meet that theme, but consistent with that theme, I often move around between two hotels in Bedford. So often I'm in the Swan, which is the other side of the river, and looking at the unattractive Mercure, which is a modern building. But instead, this time I'm in the Mercure looking at the Swan, which is a beautiful building. So that's as close to your theme as I can possibly get. I'm at an inquiry here in Bedford in front of David Walsall-Smith. I've got Anna Stein as my junior, and instead of 2 weeks, we finished the evidence in 3 days.
Bravo. Sasha, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you very much. I'm great. Unlike Chris, I won't tell the world what I'm doing because, frankly, they'll probably fall asleep. So I'm going to not say that, but no, I'm in the delights of one of the greatest urban areas in Britain, High Wycombe.
And I came to your inquiry for 5 minutes. And
You did. I had the pleasure of seeing you last Friday. I know. I thought I nearly said to throw him out.
And then, Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Neil, for a reminder of one of the finest holidays that I organised when I took my wife and youngest son to the Isle of Lewis and Orkney during the October of 2020 during lockdown, because I've always wanted to go and see Mace House, Skara Brae, the Ring of Brodgar. I always wanted to see the fantastic sights of those two fantastic islands. Unfortunately, it rained horizontally throughout our trip, so it wasn't quite as popular to those that were being dragged along, but I loved it, so I'm delighted. Thank you, Neil. And I'm currently in the glorious town of Bath, which is as far away from where I live as I can possibly imagine. So I'm delighted you're saying hello to it, Thea.
Good stuff. Well, let's crack on. And Chris, you're going to tell us about, it's been a rather uneventful week for planning infrastructure, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to tell you all about the Chancellor of the Exchequer's speech. She went to Oxfordshire and announced the government's support for the Oxford to Cambridge corridor. Remember, we had the Conservatives supported the ARC and then they didn't support it. Well, this government has come out and she said that the economy and economic growth is the number one priority. So she announced, obviously, full support for that Oxford to Cambridge corridor. Lots of things going on in Oxford and Cambridge. Economic experts anticipate that what is proposed by way of investment could add 78 billion to the economy. She also announced the expansion of Heathrow Airport. The government will not block it like the previous government, and as a consequence of which she believes that it's now up to Heathrow simply to decide. The government have already said they'll support the expansion of Stansted, and when challenged over the environmental credentials of that, she said it's all changed now because of sustainable aviation fuel, and we can take a new look at aviation. Incidentally, that Oxford to Cambridge corridor she described will be Europe's first Silicon Valley. This is all pretty exciting stuff. Reducing environmental requirements. The Chancellor has come out very clearly against the huge amounts of money that are being spent on saving bats and newts and seeking to protect them. And the Environment Agency unlocked 4,500 homes in Cambridge by virtue of releasing one of their objections. There's to be redevelopment of Old Trafford, Sasha. They need something, don't they? And the expansion of wind farms as well. The moratorium, as they describe it, that the Conservatives had on wind farms is now to be removed. They want to see huge expansion in that. So overall, very, very encouraging. I have to say, for all of us who work in this sector, her words really struck a chord when she said, it was all the problem of the last government. There was always somebody who said, we don't need to have that investment. We don't want that wind farm. We don't want those pylons. And we don't want that airport. And we don't want that housing near us. I mean, that's how we all do our job, isn't it? Because these people object in this way. And the government wants to change that. They want to change that so that this isn't the answer, she says, is not always no. That's been the problem in Britain for a long time. We have a choice between something that will grow the economy and anything else. And it's always anything else that wins. So she wants a new pro-growth economy. And that is very much coming from the Chancellor and from the Treasury. Finally, if I can just add, a happy announcement that we have 3 new silks in the planning and environmental field. Sasha Blackmore and Zach Simons at Landmark Chambers with Sasha, and Harriet Townsend at Cornerstone. It is a fantastic achievement to achieve silk, and many, many congratulations to the 3 of you, all thoroughly deserved, and we salute you in that fantastic achievement.
Bravo to the new silks. Thanks, Chris. Now, Paul, you may not be in Yorkshire, but you've got a case derived from Yorkshire to tell us about.
Yeah, well, let me just lift the veil a moment and show you how tragic my location actually is. So I'm not in Orkney. I'm in a hotel in Bath, and I've been here for a couple of weeks on an allocated site proposed for housing, and I'm proposing housing. How dare I? Which makes me the most popular person in the city. So my case, yet another case on procedure. I'm on a run of them. This is a decision of Robert Palmer KC sitting as a deputy High Court judge. The claimant, called Amalgamated Smart Metering, is a subsidiary of Mercy and Power, who operate a facility in Rotherham which tops up the electricity network when there's a period of shortage. We need you, Thea. We need those schemes. But it operates at times and without any time conditions, and it operates sometimes at times when people may be asleep and wanting peace and quiet. In June of 2024, planning permission was granted by Rotherham Council for 120 units close by at a former bus depot. AMS had objected to that scheme because the potential for noise nuisance and the potential for that noise nuisance then impacting residents and them then serving abatement notices or asking the council to serve an abatement notice, and that then impeding their ability to operate. So they'd raised quite a number of objections on a technical nature, and indeed they'd even installed a large acoustic fence nearby because of a similar problem. Once they found out about the planning permission having been granted, they sought to challenge it. The problem is that under Part 54 of the Civil Procedure Rules, you are meant to challenge a planning decision within 6 weeks. They challenged it 15 weeks after the decision on the basis that they said that they hadn't been notified and that the council hadn't put a notice in the local press and that it couldn't have reasonably come to their attention. The challenge was then made by the defendants and the beneficiary of the planning permission to say, let's strike this out because Part 11 allows me to say that the court has no jurisdiction. And it all came to a bit of a ding-dong between the parties before His Honour Judge Robert Palmer, after the matter had been referred up from Her Honour Judge Belcher on the papers, who said the matter should be dealt with on a full hearing. The small nuance is that the defendant and the interested party hadn't actually put in a defence which dealt with the substance of the claim. So there were competing applications here. So the claimant was saying, no, the court does have jurisdiction, but can you extend time to allow me to bring the proceedings? The interested party and the defendant was saying, no, the court doesn't have jurisdiction because you're over 6 weeks. But if you do have this jurisdiction, can we have permission to put a substantive defence in? And in any event, can you not extend time to allow the claim to be brought? It's a really long judgment, and it's a really interesting judgment for the most geeky of lawyers. I suspect it may not be read by very many of our viewers. However, it's really important. The court rejected the suggestion that the court had no jurisdiction because it was more than 6 weeks, and concluded it had power to extend time. So the first line of defence failed on the part of the defendant interested party, and that was kicked out. The court then allowed the interested party and the defendant to serve their substantive defences on the ground that there was no prejudice caused to the claimant, notwithstanding it was late. So the issue then turned upon whether or not there should be an extension of time by 9 weeks under Part 3 of the Civil Procedure Rules, and it's a really conventional application of principles. But just a bit of a sideline, there was a case 2 or 3 years ago where the Court of Appeal upheld a really, really long extension of time, I think more than 2.5 years, in a case called Thornton Hall, where there had been some suggestion about either inadvertent or deliberate concealment of the details of a permission online, some suggestion about impropriety behind the scenes, but where the court was prepared to extend time in really quite unusual circumstances. So what the court did in this case was it applied the Thornton Hall principles and said, well, what's actually failed? What would have been the effect? Was the prejudice the claimant? Could the claimant really have come to know about this planning permission? And what's the prejudice to the defendants and interested party? So there was an objection, interestingly, by the claimant's counsel, Greg Jones, KC, to whether or not that application should be heard at all. And Charlie will be interested in relation to this because the base of the objection was by hearing it at that stage on essentially a full hearing, that he would be prevented from having a second bite of his cherry. Because had it been considered by for judicial review, there would have been the power to renew. Well, Judge Palmer said, no, that's not fair. And there's enough here. And I've heard all the arguments and I'm prepared to make a decision. He found that the site notices had been served. That's the first point. And whilst there hadn't been a service of a notice in a local paper, he also did a really deep dive investigation in relation to what could have come to the attention of the claimant, even going so far as to look on the BBC News website and see what was kicking around to go behind a witness statement. It's a really interesting decision about essentially investigating a factual matter. I do wonder whether or not a pure planner might have done that or just dealt with it in a way which didn't start to investigate the witness witness statements, but he did and concluded that on balance, the existence of the planning permission would have been readily discernible had there been procedures in place to do it, rather than just the approach that was being taken. So it was concluded that promptitude, which is a great word that you'd never hear in any other context, promptitude and celerity, which I had to look up. It doesn't mean anything to do with salary, apparently. Neither had been shown. And that this was therefore not a Thornton Hall case, and the prejudice to the defendant and interested party outweighed the prejudice to the claimant from the case not being brought. But, and it's a big but, again, the judge went behind some of the issues to see whether or not some of the complaints that were being made on the substance of the grounds could actually be remedied at the next stage along in terms of reserved matters or by some other mechanism. It's a really proactive judgment. I commend it to not just those who are on the call who are lawyers. I commend it less to the planners, but I'd really commend it to the planning court because I think it's a really interesting case. And coming forward, next time I'm either defending or seeking to extend time, this is the case I'll be bringing it forward to say you can actually do a bit more of a deep dive investigation than just looking at the witness summons and taking them on face value. Witness statement, sorry. So that's the interesting case, Charlie, and I hope your background's a lot more interesting than mine when you take off the...
I know exactly which hotel you're in, by the way, because I've stayed there. I can recognise it. So bravo to Judge Robert Palmer, although it has been pointed out that judgment is probably not his best hit. Addicted to Love is probably a cut above, but there we are.
Charlie, don't you think, I think hats off to Paul for A, unravelling that, B, for admitting that there's a word he didn't know. We all know how clever Paul is. I can't believe he's admitting there's a word he didn't know. And C, for actually making us laugh with a joke about celery. Well done.
Bravo. No,
Here's Chris.
Battery storage. If anyone can make it interesting, it's you, Thea.
Let's.
Your bags are about to come. Come on, Thea.
With celerity, I shall try. And this is a decision of Inspector Baird, who is a very experienced inspector that some of you will know. Something of a pioneer, having granted permission for the first 49.9 megawatt solar scheme in early 2022. And now his decision on this appeal is one of the first green belt, grey belt decisions, and I'm sure will be very well received, particularly from renewable and low carbon energy developers. Now, this was a proposal for a 49.35 megawatt battery energy storage system in Walsall. The point of the development, I'm sure many of you will know, but for those who don't, is to store energy at times of low energy demand and discharge it back into the grid when it's most needed. So such systems, particularly when combined with renewables, are integral to reaching net zero, and that's set out in the national policy statements. Now, the site is in the Greenbelt and is used for the grazing of horses. You'll see there it's separated from the main urban area of Walsall by countryside, wooded areas and a golf course to the northwest. And prior to 2024, it was, of course, accepted that the scheme comprised inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, but afterwards the appellants ran a Greybelt case. As you will know, the definition of Greybelt considers whether a site strongly contributes to any of purposes A, B, and D set out at paragraph 143 of the framework, which is to check unrestricted sprawl, to prevent neighbouring towns from merging into one another, and to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. So the inspector dealt with those matters from paragraph 22 of the decision, and it was agreed that purpose D wasn't relevant, so purposes A and B were the focus of the decisions. And on purpose A, and the issue of sprawl, the inspector considered the Greenbelt review that had been undertaken to inform the Black Country Core strategy. And in that, as is so often the case, the modest appeal site formed part of a much larger unit of assessment that was 487 hectares, which the review found, unsurprisingly, made a strong contribution to purpose A. And the inspector also, unsurprisingly, didn't consider that that helped very much with the impacts of this particular site. So they then considered the role of the particular site, noting that the framework doesn't contain a definition of what might constitute sprawl, but concluded that because the development was separated from built-up areas, it would be physically and visually discrete and would not contribute strongly to purpose A. And that's an interesting one. That's perhaps an obvious point about the definition. And it's this, that sites which are divorced from existing settlements are more likely to pass that part of the definition. Now, that's fine, of course, for renewable development, but presents more of a problem for development such as housing, which needs to be locationally accessible and maximise sustainable transport solutions in line with paragraphs 155, 110 and 115 of the framework. And perhaps it's an unintended consequence of the definition that sites which are more rural, more isolated as part of the green belt will do better in terms of meeting the definition of grey belt. Now, on purpose B, the merging point, that's considered from paragraph 25. And the inspector said there that there would be a temporary loss of green belt between the towns of Walsall, Birmingham and Sutton Coldfield, and that it would contribute to the merging of those towns, but that it would be minor and there would be no material impact on the perception of the gap. So it was the effect of the scheme that led to the conclusion that the site doesn't contribute strongly to purpose B. So having gone through that analysis and determined that the site could be considered grey belt, the inspector, of course, turned his attention to paragraph 155 of the framework, which are the three criteria there, and considered that the scheme would not fundamentally undermine the purposes taken together of the remaining green belt across the area of the plan, because although there was accepted encroachment, which is almost always going to be the case where you've got green belt development in the greenfield development in the green belt, this site was small, and so it meant the impact was negligible. And on purpose E, the inspector accepted that the alternative site assessment was robust and that it demonstrated that there was a requirement for the site to be in that location because such schemes need to be located close to a point of connection to the grid. And I think the area of search in that case was about 2 kilometres. Now, unsurprisingly, there was a demonstrable need for the development. The framework tells us that. National policy statements tell us that. And as to sustainability of the location, this wasn't a type of development that would generate significant traffic movements after the initial construction. The golden rules, of course, didn't apply, this not being a housing scheme. What the inspector did then, which was very clever, after considering the grey belt points, was to consider the impact on openness and all the other harm, of course, which included, in that case, harm to a number of heritage assets, and then carried out the very special circumstances balance if it were needed, and concluded that the benefits of the proposal clearly outweighed the harm to the greenbelt and the other harms identified, such that very special circumstances exist to justify this proposal and permission should be granted. Now, I expect that alternative approach is one that a number of decision takers will adopt for some time to come. It's sensible, it challenge-proofs the decisions that they make. And of course, parties will be promoting their scheme on both a grey belt and a very special circumstances case if they are well advised, and they should. So that's that case. Well done to Stephanie Hall, who promoted the scheme in that case from King's Chambers. Well done on that one. And thank you, Charlie. Back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Thea. And without further ado, Sasha's going to take us to Kidderminster.
I am, I know. It's your and Chris territory.
Very much so.
In answer to Chris saying Paul couldn't pronounce something, I haven't understood most of what Paul said the last 5 years, I've got to admit. And everyone's not supposed to crack those jokes anymore, but
Me and Sasha are fighting. Me and Sasha are fighting over Ollie Watkins.
I know.
Let's go.
So I would make my year if Ollie Watkins signed tonight while we're on. Anyway, let me say, one of the things actually generally that Thea's just touched on that's really interesting at the moment is the expansion, definition and decisions dealing with grey belt. I mean, we're in such a brave new world about what it actually means, what Para 155 mean. And just for our audience, remember, C went out, we've got the purposes of the green belt, and we've got these fascinating 5 purposes that we all argue about, and to the extent which any site does it contribute or doesn't. And then we've got this wonderful test about A, B, and D, which of course ditched C. I don't know on Chris's advice or someone else's advice, but C went. So no longer is assisting in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment a barrier to being defined as grey belt. The case I'm going to take you to is really interesting because it was for a quarry. I mean, Thea and I are doing all the glamorous proposals on this show, but the fundamental issue that the inspector had to grapple with in the light of it being a quarry was the contention. Yes, Rob is going to show us that this is in Kidderminster. NRS Aggregates, as you can see, wanted a sand and gravel quarry, and not unsurprisingly, when you look at the address, it was in the Greenbelt. And one of the appellant's arguments, not completely unexpectedly, was that this was grey belt. Although I know the date of the decision, but I'm sure there were representations of one of the standard PIN's letter posted 12th of December about what representations you want to make in the light of the new MPPF. And one of the main issues was whether the proposal was grey belt or not. And the inspector, of course, grappled with A, B and D and the contribution that the site made to the purposes. I think for everyone interested, I think it's a really interesting decision on A, which is, of course, whether it contributes, of course, to the issue about unrestricted sprawl. And we all argue about unrestricted sprawl. What does it actually mean? And does the land in question effectively check the unrestricted sprawl? Because actually, in principle, you could have a starting point of the most extreme interpretation that everything, all greenbelt land, does contribute to that purpose. And then there's obviously a much more restrictive definition, which is that it does have to actually have a meaningful effect on sprawl. But the inspector really grapples with this in the decision and takes the view, and I think it's worth looking at 42. The appellant considers the site is grey belt because it does not strongly contribute to green belt purpose A. However, the inspector said, if sprawl is to be given its usual meaning, it seems to me that purpose A is to restrain the unrestricted straggling expansion of large built-up areas. Just have a moment to think about that. To restrain the unrestricted straggling. He introduces this word straggling. Not, Chris's eyebrows are reflecting my thoughts. This new concept of straggling. First thing I'm going to ask in my next Greenbelt con, does our site straggle the expansion of a large built-up area? But anyway, that's what the inspector is dealing with. And he goes on to say, unrestricted straggling expansion of a large built-up area would not be confined to just the land that was contiguous with the built-up area. Now, that's pretty serious as well. So sites that lie in the middle, unrestricted for large built-up areas, it doesn't actually seem to matter how close you are to a large built-up area. And he takes the view that unrestricted sprawl could, given that it could not be restricted, extend beyond land that was adjacent to a large built-up area. So that's also his view. Bottom line is, he took the conclusion that the appeal site is land that strongly contributes to greenbelt purposes, A, and so does not constitute grey-belt land. And on that basis alone, he considered the site was therefore properly to be greenbelt, went on to conclude the site was inappropriate, and of course placed the burden on the appellants in the light of that to require them to show very special circumstances, which frankly he took the view did not exist, and the planning balance was against the appellants. So I think there are two really important points. One cannot underestimate the development and evolution of grey belt cases and planning appeal decisions over the next 3 or 4 months. And of course, as we all know, the seminal decision of whether you're grey belt or green belt has massive consequences on your likelihood of getting a consent or not. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Well, without further ado, we'll start our interview with Níall. So, once again, Níall, welcome to the show. I can't remotely do justice to you by summarising your career because it'd spend up the whole half an hour. But you were born in Geneva, I think that's right. You're educated in Dublin.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
Studied architecture at University College in Dublin.
I
You're
did.
Young British Architect of the Year in 1998.
When I was young.
You won more awards than I think every barrister put together. You've got an honorary MBE. You're a Royal Academician. I was in the Royal Academy last night with Anne Christopher, one of your
wonderful person, really interesting person,
lovely lady, and she sent her regards. And you won the Sterling Prize for your new library at Magdalen College, and many more. You've exhibited the Venice Biennial. You've done it all, basically. But tell us a little bit, first of all, because there might be some budding architects who might potentially want to watch this. Tell us about your journey and how did you get to achieve such great success?
A series of accidents, I would say. I was fortunate to go to University College Dublin at a time when there was an amazing group of teachers there. And the people who were my tutors on a day-to-day basis went on to win the Pritzker Prize and the Royal Gold Medal and so on. So they were some of the finest architects of their generation. Little did I know that at the time when I was sort of, being cheeky and not attending tutorials. But it was a fantastic foundation I had in University College Dublin. My mother was born in New York, and I was on my way to America to perhaps get a citizenship and a green card. And I was passing through London, and I popped into the French House in Soho one night and met a friend of mine who said he had a spare room in a flat in Portobello Road if I wanted to share for a few weeks. And I said, why not? And I ended up living there for 25 years. So that was an extraordinary, one of those kind of forks in the path where your life takes a completely different direction. And I was fortunate to fall in with a group of people who became very good friends for the rest of my life. They became my first clients, and I absolutely loved it. And it's one of those things where the sense of London being a place that you can come and just invent yourself. And there's a fantastic sense that maybe British people aren't aware of in British culture, particularly in London, where people go, well, you've arrived. What have you got? Show us what's interesting about you. And if you can do it well, we'll let you do it. And the sense of arriving into an open society that gave me amazing opportunities is something I've always been really grateful for. So from then on, I did some work in private for working for a small practice or for other practices, but I started my own practice very early, did a combination of teaching and practicing. I began in loft conversions and house extensions and just built up bit by bit, very, very slowly. And by a couple of other strokes of good fortune, found myself doing larger institutional buildings. So it's been a really interesting journey.
Fantastic. And what makes, in your judgment, a good architect? What separates out the really good and great architects from the masses?
And I think there's a kind of a public perception of really good architects being kind of amazing kind of impresarios who produce strange forms that no one's seen before. But actually listening to all of you speaking in the last half hour, I think there are connections between what you do and what we do. And that I think let's begin with a good architect. You're dealing with a huge mass of competing requirements, competing data. It can be the amount of conflicting pieces of information that come in on any complex project are huge. And good architects have the ability to absorb that, to listen to other people, to see where the main lines of argument are running, and then to produce something that has the semblance of great simplicity and clarity. And I'm sure that many of you folks listening to that will see that in your PRs or in something that you aspire to. And I do use the word semblance advisedly because I think that the way you reason things is often a matter of the skill of making things which are complex seem simple, even when they're not always that simple. And for me, good buildings have what I would call a self-evident quality. When you look at them, you think, well, what else would they have done? And those are not always the most sort of spectacular buildings. But for me, really good architecture always has that sense that when people use it, they couldn't imagine it having been otherwise. While in fact, that the competing requirements that were brought into the project didn't offer anything that seemed like such a simple solution.
And what do you see as your own defining sort of characteristic or principles as an architect? What's your USP, if you like?
I don't see it in terms of a kind of a visual signature style. I'm not that interested in that. I think that's something that there's a couple of things I'm interested in. I like what I would call active listening. I'm genuinely very interested in what people have to say, and I pay attention to it. And I like, when I come into a project, I like thinking that I'm not going to invent the building from the innocence of my own mind, that I'm going to listen to the people who are participating in that project and produce something that I couldn't have produced if I wasn't listening to them. So that aspect of a style is more a style in the process than a style in the outcome. I happen to be deeply interested in history. I'm fascinated by it. And I like the idea of architecture as being a kind of continuity. There are very few things that tell you what time is like more than architecture. I mean, look at your backdrop there. That tells you what 3,500 or 4,500 years looks like. We can see these artifacts and understand the passage of time and the way that human communities have changed and developed over time. So it's that aspect of community or continuity that I'm really interested in. And so I see architecture as being... buildings make kind of material arguments about continuity, about reasonableness. I see it as being a kind of architecture as being a form of public reasoning in a way. And I think good buildings have that sense of reasonableness. And I would like to think that most of my good buildings are ones that people would look at and feel that they understand how they came about. They understand how they will be used. Importantly, they understand how they were constructed. And that once again, to go back to that sense of having a self-evident quality, that's what I would like to say about my work.
Fantastic. Now, moving to kind of the planning regime and how planning interrelates with architecture and design. It's been a hot potato recent years with the Office for Place that was set up and then abolished, building beautiful and then building not beautiful. What's your view? Does the UK or the English planning regime do enough to promote good design? Is there something more that could be done? Are there other countries that do it better?
I think that there's a particular aspect to British planning policy, which in a sense has its fallback, a sense of, I think, of gradualism and consensus. And I think that that's both a limitation to planning policy, but it's also a strength. It's a limitation when you want to get grand projects built, because there's always a sense that the projects have to advance by consensus. It makes planning a very kind of slow and often very complex process with a huge amount of consultation. And an architect can never assume that they're going to come in and build their dream project without pushback, without having to explain it and rationalize it and amend it and so on. So to some extent, you could say that that's a limitation in that the kind of clarity and simplicity and speed of development can be trammeled by that. But at the same time, I think it's deeply ingrained in British culture. I often think that for me, looking at it from the outside, the great Irish politician and philosopher Edmund Burke embodies a kind of an idea of British culture, which is about continuity, tradition, arguing out of the given, rather than grand abstractions and so on. And I do think that to some extent, British planning policy embodies that in some way. And so it's both a strength and a weakness.
And turning to your work, what's one project or design building are you proudest of and why? And I think we can get it up on screen. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I've chosen one which is almost from my architectural childhood. It's one of the first projects I built when I was a very young practitioner. It's a tiny little window in a house in South London, and it was done for an absolutely delightful client who I did 3 or 4 projects for. It's just the sort of simplest and smallest thing. And it was built by a joiner and a builder who I'd worked with quite a bit. It was so small and it wasn't in a conservation area that it didn't need planning consent. So it had that sort of sense of innocence. It's got an almost prelapsarian quality for me, that you could build it with people who you knew and trusted, for someone who is a client who you knew and trusted. And although it was a very simple and small thing, it has for me the key thing that I think all good buildings have, which is a sense of what I would call situatedness. So don't look at it and say, do I like what it looks like as an object? But imagine yourself sitting there on that bench with your back to the window and looking out towards the garden on a summer's afternoon and feeling that you could read a book and have a cup of tea and feel that you are situating yourself in the world and feeling at ease. And I'm someone who thinks that the best architecture helps you to do that. It helps you to place yourself in the world and feel this is a good place for doing what I want to do. And I like this little window between the inside and the outside of the house. There's a bench on the inside looking into the garden, on the outside looking into the garden, and it backs onto a bench on the inside, which looks back into the house. So it's that very simple thing that I wanted to put forward as standing for what I think architecture should be about. These shutters you can see open and close, so you can have lots of wood or lots of window, depending on the weather.
Yes. Yes, that's fantastic. And what about other people's work? Is there one or more projects that you wish had been yours, or that you like them, that you think is the particularly high quality piece of architecture?
Well, I've picked a building for this that was important for me because it's interesting. It was built by a British practice, Arensberg and Corlac. They were the people who were famous for Prince Charles saying they had created the carbuncle on the face of a well-known friend. This is a building they built in Dublin when they were very young. They were only 25 years old. It was their first project, and it was in a very sensitive historic environment in Trinity College, Dublin. It's a building that you would call a brutalist building, and it's an extremely strongly modern building put in a historic context. But the reason I chose it is when I was 17 and I was going to study English literature in university, I was walking through Trinity College, Dublin. I looked up at this building, and I don't know, but it seemed to be calling me in some way I can never quite put my finger on. And I suddenly thought, wow, there's something about this building that's communicating to me in a way that I've never experienced before. And I began to think that architecture might be something that's interesting for me. So I was really fascinated by it. And it was a building that made me want to study architecture. Now, when you go to Trinity College and the students do tours, they always stop in front of this building and say how terribly ugly it is. But I just don't see that. Even before I studied architecture, I thought it was beautiful. And those wonderful curved windows are ones that it's a library. You can carry a book from the bookshelves and sit in those windows and look down on the lawns around you. So it's a really beautiful building. And I had the privilege much later in my life, just a few years ago before they died, of sitting in a room in Kentish Town with Aarons, Burton and Corlac and talking to them about how they built the library. So it's a building very close to my heart.
And last question from me. What's the career trajectory for a budding architect these days? How does a 19 or 20-year-old become the Níall McLaughlin of the future?
I mean, first of all, you have to go through a fairly lengthy education. There are 3 parts to it. There's a 3-year kind of bachelor's course at university, which is often a BSc, which will take you up to what's called RIB Part 1. Students will then usually do a year or 2 working in an office and then go back to university to do a furthers course, which is often called a master's, which brings you to RIB Part 2. And then you do your professional qualifications about 3 years later, having worked in offices. So all in all, it's probably an 8 or 9 year education. From then, a lot of the skills of working as a practicing architect still have to be acquired while working in an office. And you would probably spend a minimum of sort of 5 to 10 years working in an office. People might then, if they wanted to open their own practice, set out to do that. And usually architects will begin by doing, small work, probably private residential work. They often get their first public commissions through small architectural competitions. And then it's a matter of skill to negotiate your way through into getting larger commissions through connections or through competitions. So that's the process of developing the career. I have to say to people who are considering it, probably as a professional career, it's worth saying that it's probably not as well remunerated as other professional careers. It certainly doesn't compare to your profession or to medicine. And many architects who are involved in the architectural profession would say that it's probably a labor of love for most architects rather than something which would be something that you would go into compared to any other profession which requires such an extensive education. And that's probably worth marking young people's cards about in advance.
But you're far, far cooler than us. Now, let's have a question for the rest of the panel. Paul.
To say Trinity College is one of the it's close to my heart. It's where I went on my first date with my wife now of 30-odd years, and that building is particularly special because during a very recent international event of great sadness, there was a sign up actually quoting Edmund Burke's famous quote about the only thing that stops evil happening. Sorry, the thing that allows evil to happen in the world is when good people do nothing. And a beautifully understated thing. So great fondness for that. So I'm with you completely. But my question is a simpler one. I live in County Durham, and I have the privilege of having visited Bishop Auckland in the last 18 months, home to the astonishing Auckland Tower. And I'm intrigued as to your thoughts about how startlingly modern designs, and that really is a startlingly modern design, can enhance and enliven heritage assets, and in this case, the Palace of the Prince Bishops.
Thank you. And it's worth saying that if you ask people in Bishop Auckland, I think the conclusion would be it's what they call a Marmite building. And, half them hate it and half them love it. And that's what I'm always told when I go there. It's worth saying that when Jonathan Ruffer, the person who is involved in the development of Auckland Castle, acquired the castle, he wanted to do something quickly that would give a sense that the project actually had legs and to make people feel that something was going to happen. And he chose that site, and we designed a couple of buildings and a master plan for the castle. And he said, could we do something that would just get the project up and going? So we went quite quickly for consent for this building that stands between the castle and the town. And I had a hunch at the beginning that if I was 12 years old and I went to see a castle, that this castle wasn't offering me many of the thrills and spills you might expect from a castle. And that just being able to climb up on something was a kind of basic requirement for the sort of family day out. Also, the castle is set in this amazing landscape where you can look down on the River Wear and even see across to Binchester where the Roman fort is. And if you could make something that allows you to look down on the castle, it would just make the whole castle experience much more interesting. Now, I think this is central to the way that we work, and I think is a good pointer for architects and planners working together. The significance of the protection of that as a heritage asset was enormous, and we had a number of senior people from Historic England coming in to interview with us and to debate with us about the design of that. And in the first instance, when we proposed a tower there, they said, absolutely not. And being an architect, I've realized now that when Historic England say absolutely not, you have to try and work your way around that in some way. And rather than saying, this is our design, we think it should be like this, why are you saying no? What we did was we engaged in a dialogue over about 9 months and probably about 6 or 7 meetings with Historic England, going back and forth and saying, well, if no, then why no? And trying to almost an academic argument. And I found that with good people in Historic England, they can be extremely flexible in proper dialogue and in proper debate. So I was asking them to set out what the properties of the castle were that prevented that from being acceptable, and then seeing if I could amend the proposal to see if it could become acceptable. And over a series of meetings, what we discovered was that our stone tower looked too much like the castle and seemed as though the castle was looking down on the town. And so I could distill their objection into that. So I went away and found a book by a famous 19th century architectural historian called Viollet-le-Duc, which was about siege engines and the machinery of fortification. And I showed them an image of a medieval siege engine, which was made of timber, and said, well, what if the castle isn't looking down on the town? What if the town is looking down on the castle? And what if the structure is not a stone part of the castle, but the kind of temporary structure that often gets pushed up against castle walls? And they said, then that would be acceptable. And they even suggested that it should be higher. So we were able to, through dialogue, come to a point where we had a shared understanding of what the tower could be. And so the slightly kind of spiky timber framey character of that tower comes from the sort of temporary structures that would be associated with medieval architecture, and has a little bit of a hint of kind of temporary mining structures as well, which of course in that part of the world is welcome.
I love it. So it's a privilege to say thank you for it. I now love it even more. Now I can go back and look at it as a siege tower. Thank you, Níall.
Thank you.
What you didn't know is Paul's a massive love of all things medieval. If there's anybody I know who owns a medieval siege engine, it will be him.
Well, I recommend the Duke's book on siege, on medieval fortifications. It's one of the great architectural texts.
I'll see if it's on Amazon now. Thank you.
Yes, literally. Thea, what's your question for Níall?
Oh, thank you. And hello again, Níall.
Hello.
Hi, you've worked on affordable housing schemes, and I wondered what the particular challenges were for projects that don't have an unlimited budget.
I think that what I'm interested in affordable housing is the experience of the people who are living in the building. And there's a way in which, I mean, we've just talked about the tower at Auckland Castle as being this kind of sensational object in a way. When you're doing affordable housing, it's almost the exact opposite. And there are certain criteria that I apply that are to do with quite simple things, which is, if you have circulation spaces, do they have daylight in them? Can you have daylight in the bathrooms? If mum or dad have come home from work and they're preparing dinner, can they supervise the children playing in the playground nearby? Passive supervision, quite simple relational things. If you have a balcony, can you use it to store all the odds and sods that people want to put on balconies? Or is it hanging off the building like something that could only be occupied by a prima donna? Quite simple things that are in the grain of everyday life. And maybe the best social housing project which we did is the one down in Whitechapel, which is quite a small project. But all of the living rooms and all of the houses have got light coming from two directions. Most of the kitchens overlook the playground, so you can watch the kids while you're going about your task. There's ventilation and daylight in the circulation spaces. The bathrooms are naturally ventilated. Really quite simple things. And what you find is if you obey those rules, then even the urban grain of what you're doing has to reduce and become smaller. And in a sense, the building can then be quite ordinary. And when I'm teaching students, I call things like that what I call the carbohydrate. It's just the ordinary stuff of the city. It makes the walls of the city, it encloses spaces of the city, and people come and go and live their lives. And even if you never notice it, it can be doing a very good job. And I have to say, when I'm feeling a bit despairing or disillusioned, I usually go down to Whitechapel and sit in the playground and on a bench and just watch people coming to and fro from the building. Do you realize that your buildings, most good buildings just disappear after a while. People use them habitually. And if they're using them habitually in a way which is comfortable and supports their lives, then they're doing a very good job.
Sasha, what about your question?
Thank you very much, Charlie. Níall, can I ask you two questions? Just one's quick. You talked about that lovely building at Trinity College, Dublin, which I know well. And I must say, I absolutely love the building you did at Worcester College. We had reason to do an event. I think it's called the Sultan Nasreen Shah Centre. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I recommend it to all our viewers. I can't remember a building that's been more uplifting being inside it. The light, and of course, as a cricket fan, I love its relationship, the cricket ground outside, and it's just that auditorium is we always slightly get depressed in lecture theatres. That's a very special lecture room or auditorium. So I cannot commend you enough. I just wanted to ask, you were talking about how much you like that building in Dublin, the Trinity College one. What building in London do you walk past and your spirit sinks as a colleague of yours has signed something which actually really upsets you, or you just find, frankly, it just completely gives you the creeps in the nicest possible way?
Oh, I'm going to have to think about that. I just want to point out to you as an aside, if you know that building in Trinity College Dublin, and you know the cricket pitch in Trinity College Dublin, the very corner of the cricket pitch is a building called a pavilion, which has got a lovely set of steps which come down to the cricket pitch, and people sit there having drinks and watch the cricket. So when I was designing the Sultan Nasreen Shah building for Worcester College, I was thinking about the building had to be raised 1.5 meters above the flood level of the river, which is nearby. And I immediately thought of the cricket pavilion at Trinity College Dublin and thought, I'll do my little version of Dublin here in Oxford. So that's a connection for you. I'm trying to think of buildings that I despair over. I'm not someone who likes to be very critical of other architects.
Well, let's make it easier then. We won't risk offending. You won't get a nasty email this evening from someone you've vetted. Go back in time, a historic building that you just think is completely wrong. It's actually quite an interesting debate because obviously there is such an emphasis in listing buildings on age rather than quality. Is there a building in London that you just think is completely overrated from the past?
I think that... to me, one of my main concerns, or the two things that I dislike are buildings which are excessively large without enough activity around the ground plane, and that create this kind of very inert areas around them. And when it comes to traditional buildings, there are some government buildings down around Whitehall which have that kind of character, where you're walking past miles of it before you see an entrance, and then it's very protected. I think that I suppose the second thing I like is buildings which are very obviously showy. In other words, that most of the architectural energy has gone into creating some kind of sensation or some kind of image. And that's something which I kind of dislike in buildings. And you're often looking at buildings and thinking, God, in 10 years' time, people are going to be really embarrassed by that. So that sense of the sort of fads that go through the architecture industry, that people are doing syncopated windows or things that do this, or, you know, that you think, oh, that's just going to age so badly. So buildings which are treated as inert objects, which are then prided purely on the kind of visual sensation they provide, are the opposite to what I like. You can see from what I'm saying is I like buildings which are kind of lived and inhabited and permeable to the city. So, I mean, one of the buildings which I love, but is a wonderful monster, is the Palace of Westminster. I just think it's kind of I think it's an amazing artifact, and I think it's so English. People who are interested can go to my website and see a little film I made of it. And I made an argument between Burke and Payne, saying that, in a sense, the Palace of Westminster tries to embody Burke's idea of the English Constitution. The kind of gradualism that's kind of philosophically embodied in the English Constitution is then tried to be recreated in the Palace of Westminster. And the way that Pugin was then given the job of trying to kind of tart it up as a neo-Gothic building. So that's one of the buildings that I absolutely love it, but is a kind of wonderful monster.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to check out that video, Neil. Chris, your question for Neil.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to meet Neil. I have to say that you mentioned both the Palace of Westminster and Prince Charles' comment about carbuncle. I think we need to acknowledge that Charlie went to Buckingham Palace yesterday and met Keir Starmer and the King in the same afternoon and chatted to both of them, which is
Wonderful.
pretty extraordinary, Charlie, as a newly enabled lord. I have to say, I've been looking at your architectural portfolio. I noticed that your firm did something for Bedford School, where I happen to be here in Bedford on De Paris Avenue. And I did an appeal here about 5 years ago for a school which is built on top of a hill with fantastic views everywhere, but very, very difficult to get. It was arguing over traffic. So our life isn't that exciting, actually. If you think it's worth being paid more money to argue over microsimulation models, you're mistaken. But what I would say is, those are examples of really uplifting buildings. And there's a lack of bravery, isn't there, in our planning system, at least, to accept dramatic new buildings in dramatic new locations. Do you agree with that? And if so, how do we overcome it? How do we become more brave about accepting new and innovative architecture in new locations?
I think there is a real danger in the planning system that that risks are not taken. And I think that has to be a combination of a failure of education and communication. I think that I mean, it's changed positively to some extent from my initial experience when I came to this country, but there was slightly a feeling when I came here first that the police were there to protect you from burglars and the planners were there to protect you from architects. And I think that that sense of a kind of standoff between the culture of what you might call the high culture of architecture and the ordinary culture of what people want from their buildings. And I think that gap, it has to be a gap of mutual education. I don't put it down to one side or the other. In Switzerland, where they have a lot of referendums for their buildings, there is a kind of an acceptance of modern architecture, but also modern architecture then has to find a way of being acceptable in its turn, because people actually vote on the projects. And I think one of the things I see in British culture is a kind of a standoff between a culture that looks at modern architecture as though it's a sign for something that people don't like, and is then instantly rejected almost on the image of the building. At the same time, a desire for architects to produce buildings which have a level of abstraction that people don't intuitively feel well about. And I think the sense of mutual education and mutual dialogue that would allow people to have confidence. Now, one of the things that I find is that we work often in very highly sensitive historic environments, and it's often easier dealing with we're doing a bold building in an historic environment than it is with doing an ordinary building in an average conservation area. And the reason is that the people you're dealing with in historic England are often just more confident and more literate than a lot of other conservation officers. So they're not simply applying it by the book. We talked about Auckland Castle. That was a very good example of it. The building we did for Magdalen College, which, I mean, there had hardly been a building built on that site since the 17th century. Yeah. But the person who we were dealing with with Historic England was confident enough in their own judgment and in their own education to take a risk on the building. And there had been a conversation about whether you could even put a building on that site at all. And his judgment was that the building was sufficient quality that it could be put on that site. So the fact of even having a building on the site was driven by the design quality that he saw on the solution that we were bringing forward. He was willing to back his judgment on that. And I think having more people in the planning process who have that education and who have that willingness to back their own judgment and to know that they're dealing with good architects and it's possible to come to a good solution and then to back it is important. And I think also there has to be a lot of weight put onto planning committee members, the elected members in planning committees, who will often find it too easy to sort of back the prejudices of people who haven't looked at it that closely. And so often we're in a situation where we've worked in dialogue with planning officers over a number of years to get backing for a proposal, to have it turned down at committee. In most instances, we then win those that appeal, by which stage our clients have spent a large amount of their budget just getting planning consent. And I think that as a process to me is inherently problematic. I do accept, going back to my image of architecture as being a kind of public reasoning, that the planning process is reinforcing that public reasoning and that the dialogue that's required to bring buildings about is absolutely important for consensus. But there has to be a point where at some stage you're saying that it's reasonable to build that building and then to back the designer's judgment in terms of the quality they can bring to it.
Fascinating, really fascinating. Thank you.
Níall, we've come to the end of the show. I could go on for another 2 hours, actually. Absolutely fascinating. I've learned so much in the last hour. It's been a thoroughly intellectually, culturally enriching hour. So thank you very much indeed, Níall, on behalf of all of us and all our viewers. And I'm going to go watch that video that you've made about the Palace of Westminster tonight.
It's great. Very nice to talk to you all. And thanks for your interest.
Thank you very much.
You challenged me. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Níall.
Bye-bye.